Naira's fingers coiled into Varric Monteluce's silk tie, jerking his chin down with a violence that forced his eyes away from the exit and onto her. "Don't look up," she hissed, her voice a serrated blade against his ear. "Sniper at the south balcony, 2 o'clock. Your driver just signaled the green light. Kiss me or you're a memory." Varric's hand shot up, his palm slamming against the small of her back, half reflexive threat, half desperate anchor. Before he could speak, the air screamed. The glass partition shattered exactly where his temple had been 3 seconds before, raining crystalline shards over his bespoke suit like a baptism of fire. 11:45 p.m. on a rain-drenched Thursday, and the Onyx Lounge smelled of expensive tobacco, aged cognac, and the cold, metallic scent of impending violence. It was a fragrance Naira Belwyn recognized as the scent of the fall, the particular musk of men who ruled through fear and the quiet rot of those waiting to take their place. It was the smell of money so heavy it distorted the air around it, the kind that clung to Varric Monteluce. At 38, Varric didn't just walk into a room, he commanded the gravity within it. He stood on the threshold of the lounge, his sharp, scarred jawline catching the warm amber glow of the chandeliers, his profile a silhouette of absolute, arrogant stillness. To him, the world was a chessboard he had already won. Naira stood by the heavy oak doors she had just opened, shivering as the damp city wind carried the smell of wet pavement and the electric hum of a city that was currently hunting them. She watched through the glass as Mail Orsic, the driver Varric had trusted for a decade, stood by the idling black sedan. Mail didn't look at the car. He adjusted his watch twice, a deliberate rhythmic tap. To anyone else, it was a nervous habit. To Naira, it was a dead man's confirmation. The Judas kiss had been delivered, and the king was seconds away from his crosshairs. The scream of the wind through the shattered pane was louder than the screams of the socialites diving for cover. Varric's grip on Naira's waist tightened, his knuckles white, his mind still catching up to the reality that his life had just been measured in millimeters. He didn't pull away. He stared into Naira's eyes, searching for the fear he expected to find in a waitress. Instead, he found a cold, tactical depth that mirrored the abyss of his own soul. "Move," Naira commanded, her voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. She didn't let go of his tie, using it to steer him toward the shadow of a marble pillar. "Who are you?" Varric rasped, his voice raw. The calculating intensity in his gaze was now spiked with a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, genuine uncertainty. "The person making sure your brains don't end up on the upholstery," she snapped. She didn't look at him, her eyes were locked on the street outside. Through the jagged hole in the glass, the rain lashed in, smelling of ozone and gunpowder. Outside, Mail Orsic hadn't moved toward the car to help. He was backing away, his hand disappearing into the breast of his coat. Naira saw the glint of steel. "The lounge isn't a sanctuary anymore, Varric. It's a kill box. Your security team is on Mail's payroll or they're already dead in the kitchen." Varric looked toward the service entrance. His 2 primary bodyguards were stepping out, but their weapons weren't pointed at the shattered window. They were leveled at him. The betrayal was absolute, a systemic rot that had turned his own castle into a tomb. The safe, amber light of the Onyx Lounge now felt like a spotlight on a stage where he was the only target. "The back stairwell leads to the service alley," Varric said, his shock hardening into a lethal, quiet rage. He reached into the hidden holster at the small of his back, drawing a suppressed P30L with a grace that spoke of 1,000 dark nights. "But it's coded, only my biometrics." "I already bypassed the circuit when I started my shift," Naira interrupted, finally releasing his tie. She reached into her vest and pulled out a small, modified transmitter. "I knew the locks were compromised the moment I saw Mail's watch tap. Follow my lead or stay here and let them finish the job." Another round hissed through the air, thudding into the mahogany bar and sending a spray of vintage bourbon into the air. The scent of alcohol and wood smoke intensified. Varric looked at the waitress, the woman who had just dragged a Mafia king by the throat to save him, and realized the hierarchy of the world had shifted in a single heartbeat. "Lead the way, watchman," he murmured, the scar on his cheek twitching as he stepped into her shadow. They moved as one, a blur of white silk and black shadows, disappearing into the service corridor just as the doors burst open behind them. The hunt had begun, and for the first time in his life, the predator was the one being tracked. The service corridor was a narrow throat of concrete and fluorescent hum, a stark contrast to the velvet luxury they had just fled. Varric moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who had spent his life navigating the dark, but his mind was a chaotic storm of static. Every time he blinked, he saw the rhythmic double tap of Mael's thumb against his watch, a gesture he had seen 1,000 times from the driver's seat. It was a signal of punctuality, of readiness. Now it was the cold geometry of a death sentence. 10 years. Mael had been the shadow at Varric's shoulder since the days of the Soul Docks. He had stitched Varric's wounds in back-alley clinics and shared silent cigarettes over the bodies of their common enemies. To Varric, Mael wasn't just a driver. He was a piece of the architecture of his life. "Keep your head down," Naira whispered, her voice snapping him back to the damp reality of the stairwell. She held her transmitter like a talisman, her eyes scanning the shadows for the infrared glint of a secondary hit team. "He was at my mother's funeral," Varric said, the words slipping out like a drop of blood on white snow. He sounded less like a Mafia boss and more like a man realizing the ground beneath him was actually a trapdoor. "He stood guard while I buried the only person I ever loved. How do you buy a decade of loyalty, Naira? What was the price?" "Territory," Naira replied without looking back, her boots clicking softly against the metal grates. "The Dark Syndicate doesn't just offer money, Varric. They offer the one thing men like Mael crave more than safety, a seat at the table you've kept him away from for 10 years. In his head, he isn't a traitor. He's a revolutionary taking back what he's owed." Varric's jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek turning a jagged white. The betrayal tasted like ash. It wasn't just the threat of the bullet, it was the erasure of his history. If Mael was a lie, then every victory, every shared secret, and every moment of perceived safety over the last decade was a hallucination. He felt the phantom weight of the driver's ghost sitting in the empty space beside him, the memory of a man who had already died the moment he sold his soul to the syndicate. "I gave him a home," Varric murmured, his hand tightening around the grip of his P30L. "You gave him a gilded cage," Naira countered, pausing at the heavy steel exit door. She turned to look at him, her gaze piercing through his armor of grief. "The ghost of your friend is trying to put you in a coffin. You can mourn him after we survive the night, or you can let your sentimentality be the second bullet that finished what the sniper started." Varric looked at the door, then at the woman who seemed to know the price of everything. The grief didn't disappear, but it crystallized into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. The man who had driven him was gone, only the target remained. "Open it," Varric commanded, his voice returning to the low, terrifying resonance of a king reclaimed. "Let's see what else the darkness has in store." The rain outside was a deluge, turning the neon signs of the district into bleeding smears of violet and gold. They had taken refuge in the skeletal remains of a subway station currently under renovation, the air thick with the scent of damp concrete and rust. Varric leaned against a support beam, his bespoke suit ruined, watching Naira as she worked. She had a small, military-grade tablet wired into a junction box, her fingers flying across the screen with a fluid, rhythmic precision that had nothing to do with waiting tables. "A waitress shouldn't know how to bypass a rolling code encryption in under 40 seconds, Varric remarked, his voice echoing in the hollow space. He kept his weapon low but ready, his eyes never leaving her profile. And a waitress certainly doesn't recognize a dead man's confirmation from 100 paces. Who are you, Naira? And don't tell me you're just a girl from the neighborhood with a hobby." Naira didn't look up, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her eyes like a digital sea.
I was a senior analyst for the agency's financial crimes division. My specialty wasn't just tracking money, it was predicting the behavior of the people who move it. I was the one they sent in when the numbers didn't add up, the ghost in the machine who could find a needle in a haystack and tell you who manufactured the needle. Varric's brow furrowed. A ghost doesn't end up serving drinks in the Onyx Lounge unless she's running from a bigger haunting. I found a pattern, she said, her voice dropping to a low, hard vibration. A systematic embezzlement scheme involving high-ranking officials and the very syndicate that just tried to put a hole in your head. I blew the whistle, thinking the system would protect the truth. Instead, the system tried to erase it. They burned my credentials, put a bounty on my identity, and turned me into a phantom. I've been hiding in plain sight for 3 years, Varric. I took the job at the lounge because it was the one place where men like you are too busy looking at themselves to notice someone like me. Varric stepped closer, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent his life navigating the underworld, but he had never encountered a weapon quite like this. A woman who saw the world not as a battlefield of bullets, but as a map of inevitable betrayals. He saw the scars of her past not on her skin, but in the way she anticipated the enemy's next move before they even made it. "You're an auditor," Varric murmured, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his sharp features. "You didn't save me because you're a hero. You saved me because I'm the only piece on this board you can still use to get to them." Naira finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I saved you because the pattern told me that if you die tonight, this city falls to a group of men who make you look like a saint. I'm not an auditor anymore, Varric. I'm the person who knows where the bodies are buried because I'm the one who counted the shovels." She disconnected the tablet and stood up, the light on the screen flickering out. "The syndicate is using your own biometric signature to track us. They're not just hunting you, they're using your pulse to find our location. If we're going to survive the next hour, we have to stop running and start rewriting the code of your empire." Varric looked at her for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with the birth of a new, dangerous alliance. "Then tell me, Watchman," he said, a grim smile touching his lips, "how do we kill a ghost?" The subway tunnels felt like the intestines of a dying beast, dripping with oily condensation and humming with the distant vibration of trains that shouldn't be running this late. Naira led the way, her movements fluid and purposeful, while Varric followed, his heavy footsteps muffled by the layer of grime on the concrete. The neon shadows of the district above filtered through the sidewalk grates in rhythmic slashes of electric blue and caustic pink, illuminating the air like a strobe light in a slaughterhouse. "They're close," Naira whispered, her hand going up to signal a halt. She didn't need a radar. She could feel the shift in the air pressure, the subtle change in the tunnel's acoustics. The syndicate cleaners weren't street thugs. They were surgical. Ex-military contractors who moved in tight, 3-man stacks, silenced barrels leading the way. 3 of them, 50 yards back. They're using thermal imaging to cut through the dark. Varric checked his magazine, the metallic click of the slide sounding like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. "Then we stop playing hide-and-seek. I don't run from my own shadows, Naira." "You do when they can see your heartbeat through a wall," she countered, pulling him into the alcove of an abandoned maintenance room. She reached into her vest and pulled out a high-intensity flare and a roll of copper wire. "We're in a blind spot in the city's grid. They'll lose our biometric pings for 90 seconds. We have to make them count." As she worked, rigging a primitive but effective thermal decoy, using the steam types and the flare, Varric watched the tunnel entrance. The first cleaner appeared, a silhouette of matte black tactical gear, his movements mechanical and devoid of hesitation. Behind him, 2 more shadows fanned out, their suppressed weapons sweeping the darkness with lethal intent. "Now," Naira breathed. She triggered the flare. The sudden eruption of magnesium light blinded the cleaner's night vision optics, turning their world into a searing white void. Varric didn't wait. He stepped from the alcove, his P-30L barking 3 times in rapid succession. The muffled thud-thud-thud was followed by the wet sound of bodies hitting the concrete. He didn't look for confirmation. He knew his mark. "One more," Naira warned, pointing toward the ceiling. A cleaner had bypassed the floor entirely, crawling along the rusted ventilation ducts. He dropped like a predatory spider, a serrated combat knife aimed at Varric's throat. Naira reacted before Varric could swing his weapon. She lunged forward, her tactical vest taking the brunt of the impact as she used the man's own momentum to slam him against the jagged edge of a steel beam. Varric finished the job with a single cold shot. The silence returned, heavier than before, broken only by the hiss of the dying flare and the steady drip of water. Varric looked at the fallen men, his city's supposed protectors, and then at Naira. Her face was smudged with soot, her white shirt stained with more than just rain, but her eyes remained as sharp as a diamond's edge. "They'll send more," she said, her chest heaving as she wiped a smear of blood from her cheek. Mail knows we're heading for the server hub. He knows the only way to kill the ghost is to burn the machine. Varric reached out, his hand lingering for a moment on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that felt alien to a man who had spent a decade trusting no one. "Then let's give him a fire he can't put out."
The air inside the decommissioned server hub was stagnant, smelling of burnt ozone and decades of dust. This was the city's digital graveyard, a place where old data went to rot. But for Naira, it was a sanctuary of switches and fiber optics. She moved to a terminal that looked like a relic of a forgotten era, but beneath its battered casing, the heartbeat of the city's hidden networks still pulsed. Varric stood guard at the heavy iron door, his silhouette framed by the flickering green light of the monitors, his weapon a silent promise of death to anyone who dared enter. "I'm in," Naira whispered, her fingers blurring across the keys. The screen bled red as layers of encryption peeled away like skin. "The Syndicate isn't just a shadow organization, Varric. It's a marketplace. They've turned your life into a commodity." Varric didn't turn around, but his shoulders tightened. "Tell me the price." Naira hesitated, the data streaming before her eyes, forming a ledger of blood that was more detailed than any CIA dossier. It wasn't just a number, it was a breakdown of his assets, his influence, and the cost of his removal. 20 million, she finally said, the words heavy in the hollow room. But that's not the part that matters. Look at the subledger, Varric. The payout isn't going to a shell company in the Caymans. It's being diverted into a trust fund for a girl named Hannah Orsic. The name hit Varric like a physical blow. He turned, the cold amber light of the terminal catching the raw shock in his eyes. Hannah? Mael's sister? She's been in a specialized clinic for years, chronic respiratory failure. I've been paying for her treatment myself. "You were paying for her life," Naira said, her voice softening with a rare flicker of empathy. "But the Syndicate offered him her health. They've promised a lung transplant from a black site donor, something your money couldn't buy on the open market. Mael didn't sell you for a throne, Varric. He sold you for a miracle." The revelation was a different kind of violence. Varric walked toward the screen, staring at the digital price tag placed on his soul. The Syndicate had weaponized love, turning a man's greatest virtue into his most lethal betrayal. The logic of the underworld was usually simple: greed, power, revenge. But this was surgical. This was the darkness Naira had warned him about, a force that knew exactly which string to pull to make a kingdom collapse from within. "He thinks he's saving her," Varric murmured, his hand trembling slightly as it rested on the terminal. "He thinks my blood is the currency for her breath." "The ledger shows the transaction is already pending," Naira added, her eyes scanning a secondary window of encrypted comms. "But there's a catch. The Syndicate has no intention of saving her. Once you're dead, they'll liquidate Mael too. He's a loose end, Varric, a ghost in waiting." Varric looked at Naira, the wary respect in his eyes deepening into a tactical covenant. He wasn't just a Mafia boss anymore, and she wasn't just an analyst.
They were the only two people who saw the full map of the rot. "They've used his heart against me," Varric said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, steady calm. "Now, use your machine to find where they're holding her. If Mael wants to sell my soul for a miracle, I'm going to show him that the devil he knows is better than the one he doesn't."
The safe house was a blind apartment in the industrial district, smelling of dust and the metallic tang of Naira's cooling tablet. Rain hammered against the reinforced shutters, a rhythmic drumming that felt like a countdown. They weren't there for 5 minutes before the locks hissed and the heavy steel door swung open with a slow, deliberate groan. Male Orsic stepped into the room, silhouetted by the flickering hall light. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He held a single, suppressed pistol, his posture weary rather than aggressive. Behind him, the silhouettes of 3 syndicate cleaners lingered in the hallway like gargoyles. "Varric," Male said, his voice thick with a decade of shared history. He didn't look at the gun in Varric's hand. He looked at the man he had served. "I didn't want it to be like this, not in a hole like this." Varric's jaw was a ridge of stone. "You sold me for a transplant, Male. You put a price on the man who called you brother." Male flinched, but he didn't lower his weapon. He shifted his gaze to Naira, his eyes narrowing with a calculated poison. "Is that what she told you? The auditor with the secret past? Varric, look at her. Look at the way she handles a weapon. Look at how she knew the sniper was there before the laser even touched your suit." Naira stood perfectly still, her hands away from her belt, her expression a mask of analytical ice. "I saw the pattern, Male. I saw the watch tap." "You saw an opportunity," Male spat, turning back to Varric. "She isn't here to save you, Varric. She's a ghost for a reason. The agency didn't burn her, she burned them. She's a deep cover specialist sent to dismantle your empire from the inside out because the feds couldn't do it with a badge. She used the sniper as a meet-cute to get into your head, to make you trust her while she drains your accounts and maps your routes for a federal sweep. She's the Trojan horse, and you've let her right into the heart of the kingdom." The air in the room became heavy, a psychological kill box where words were more lethal than lead. Varric's eyes flickered toward Naira, a shadow of doubt crossing his face. It was the Judas kiss, the final betrayal designed to isolate the target before the kill. "Varric," Naira said, her voice low and steady. "He's weaponizing your fear of being alone. He needs you to doubt me so you'll walk out that door and into their custody. If I wanted you dead, I would have let the glass take your head an hour ago. Or maybe you just needed me alive long enough to get the biometric codes for the main vault," Male countered, taking a slow step forward. "Varric, come with me. I can still protect you. We can save Hana together. Don't die for a woman who didn't exist until 2 hours ago." Varric looked at the man who had been his shadow for 10 years, and then at the woman who had been his light for one night. He saw the desperation in Male's eyes, the lie he had told himself to justify the blood on his hands, and he saw the cold, hard truth in Naira's. "Male," Varric said softly, raising his pistol until it centered on his friend's chest. "You always were a bad liar. You didn't come here to save me. You came here to see if I'd make it easy for you." The silence that followed was the sound of a decade breaking. Male's face contorted, the mask of the brother falling away to reveal the hollow man beneath. The tension snapped with the sound of a suppressed gunshot, but it didn't come from Varric or Male. A secondary sniper, positioned in the building across the narrow alley, sent a round through the reinforced shutter that Male had left slightly ajar. The bullet didn't find its mark, but the heavy wood splintered, and a jagged shard caught Varric in the side of the neck, while a second follow-up shot tore through his shoulder. He collapsed back against the wall, his pistol clattering to the floor as his hand went to the blossoming crimson on his suit. Male froze, realizing his syndicate handlers had just tried to clear the room with everyone in it. "No!" he screamed toward the window, but the cleaners in the hall were already kicking the door. Naira didn't hesitate. The waitress was gone, replaced by the lethal efficiency of a woman who had been trained to survive the impossible. She lunged into the blind spot behind the door as it burst open, her movements a blur of calculated violence. She caught the first cleaner's wrist, snapping it with a sickening crunch, and used his own weapon to put 2 rounds into the second man's chest. "Varric, get down," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that left no room for doubt. She spun, sweeping Varric's fallen pistol from the floor with her foot and catching it mid-air. She fired over her shoulder, forcing the third cleaner back into the hallway, then slammed the heavy steel bolt home. The safe house was now a fortress of one. Varric was slumped on the floor, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. The blood was dark and fast, staining the white silk of his shirt. He looked up at Naira, his vision blurring, and saw her not as a shadow or an analyst, but as a guardian. She moved with a tactical grace that was terrifying to behold, checking the perimeter, reloading the spent magazines, and then dropping to her knees beside him without dropping her guard. "Pressure," she said, grabbing a discarded linen towel and jamming it against his shoulder. "Hold it there. If you faint, we both die." You should have left," Varric managed, a grimace of pain twisting his features. "Mail was right. You don't owe me a grave." "I told you, Varric. I'm finishing the pattern," Naira replied, her eyes tracking the movement of shadows beneath the door. She reached into her vest and pulled out a small, high-yield flashbang. "They think you're the target. They don't realize I'm the one they should have been worried about." She stood up, silhouetted against the dim, flickering light of the room. In that moment, the power dynamic was fully realized. The Mafia boss, the man who owned the city, was bleeding out on a dirty floor, and the woman the world had tried to erase was the only thing standing between him and the dark. She wasn't just defending a man, she was defending the truth she had been forced to hide. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her finger tightening on the trigger as the hallway erupted in a fresh wave of gunfire. "I'm going to show them what happens when you try to hunt a ghost." The safe house was a symphony of chaos, but within the small circle of light from her tablet, Naira created a vacuum of absolute focus. Varric lay against the base of the kitchen island, his breathing shallow and labored, his hand clamped over the saturated towel. Outside the steel door, the cleaners were regrouping, the rhythmic thud of a battering ram beginning to vibrate through the floorboards. "Give me 2 minutes," Naira murmured, her eyes reflecting the cascading green waterfalls of code. "If I can't stop their hearts, I'll stop their blood. In this world, that's the same thing." Her fingers moved with the frantic grace of a concert pianist. She wasn't just hacking, she was performing a digital assassination. She bypassed the syndicate's primary firewalls by piggybacking on the biometric signal Varric's own phone had been leaking, using the enemy's tracking device as a skeleton key. One by one, the vaults began to appear on her screen, encrypted offshore accounts in Panama, shell companies in Luxembourg, and the dark ledger that held the syndicate's liquid assets. Varric watched her, a ghost of a smile touching his bloodless lips. He had spent his life using lead and steel to solve his problems, but Naira was dismantling an empire with light and logic. "Cracking the first layer," she whispered. "Mail's miracle fund diverted. The cleaner's payroll frozen." She didn't just stop at the money. She injected a polymorphic virus into their communication hub, a logic bomb that began to delete the syndicate's internal dossiers. Names, faces, bank accounts, and evidence of high-level corruption began to evaporate into the ether. It was a scorched earth policy. By the time the ram hit the door for the 3rd time, the men on the other side were no longer working for a powerful organization. They were working for a ghost that couldn't pay them. "I'm initiating a total liquidation," Naira said, her voice hard and final. "Every cent they've stolen is being moved into untraceable crypto sinks or donated to the very clinics they used as bait.
The syndicate is officially bankrupt, Varric. They're a snake with no head and a starving belly. The terminal let out a long, high-pitched chime. Transaction complete. Across the city and in the hallway just feet away, hundreds of encrypted phones chimed simultaneously. It was the sound of 1,000 contracts being canceled. The banging on the door stopped abruptly. Through the silence, they heard the panicked murmurs of the cleaners as they checked their accounts. The loyalty of a mercenary is only as thick as his wallet, and Naira had just made them all paupers. "It's done," she said, leaning back as the tablet's screen faded to black. She looked at Varric, her eyes wide and dark. They're not hunters anymore. They're prey. Their own associates will tear them apart before the sun comes up to see who gets the scraps. Varric reached out, his bloody fingers brushing her hand. "You didn't just save my life, Naira. You burned the world that tried to take it." "Not the world," she corrected, helping him to his feet as the sounds of retreating footsteps echoed in the hall. "Just the parts of it that were built on lies."
The rooftop of the Lottie World Tower was a jagged island of steel and glass floating in a sea of storm clouds. At this height, the rain didn't fall. It screamed, horizontal and cold, blurring the line between the sky and the abyss. Varric stood by the helipad's edge, his silhouette swaying as he leaned on Naira for support. The blood loss had carved hollows into his cheeks, making his sharp jawline look like a blade, but his eyes were fixed on the man waiting for them near the maintenance gantry. Male Orsic looked broken. The syndicate's collapse had been instantaneous. His comms were dead, his cleaners had vanished into the night, and the promise of a miracle for his sister had evaporated with a single keystroke from Naira. He held his weapon with a trembling hand, the barrel wavering between Varric's chest and the rain-slicked floor. "It was supposed to be simple, Varric," Mael shouted over the roar of the wind. "A life for a life. Your empire was already rotting. Why couldn't you just die and let her breathe?" Varric stepped away from Naira, his boots crunching on the gravel. He moved with a heavy, final, deliberate grace, his ruined suit flapping in the gale like the wings of a fallen bird. He didn't raise his gun. He simply walked until the barrel of Mael's pistol was inches from his heart. "Because the miracle they promised you was a lie, Mael," Varric said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Naira found the records. They were never going to save Hana. They were going to use her to keep you on a leash until you outlived your usefulness. You traded my soul for a ghost." Mael's face contorted, a primal sob lost in the wind. "I had to try. What am I supposed to do now? Everything is gone." Naira stood 10 paces back, her hand hovering over the tablet she still carried, the device that had stripped the world of its masks. "Mael, listen to me," she called out, her voice a calm anchor in the storm. "The money is gone, but the truth is out. We've rerouted the legitimate funds from Varric's clean assets to Hana's clinic. She's safe, but if you pull that trigger, you prove the syndicate was right about you." Varric looked at Mael, then back at Naira. For a decade, his answer to betrayal was a shallow grave. Every instinct he possessed screamed for revenge, to watch the light leave the eyes of the man who had sold him to the dark. But as he looked at Naira, he saw the new path she had built through the code. She hadn't just saved his life, she had offered him a way to exist without being a monster. "Revenge is a debt that never gets paid, Mael," Varric said softly, his hand reaching out to slowly push the gun barrel aside. "I'm tired of being a king of corpses. Walk away. Take your sister and disappear. If I see you again, the pattern ends differently. But tonight, the Watchman has decided you live." Mael stared at him, the realization of his mercy hitting harder than any bullet. He dropped the gun, his knees hitting the wet concrete. He was no longer a traitor or a driver. He was just a man lost in the rain. Varric turned his back on the past, walking toward Naira. The wind caught his coat, but he didn't stumble. He looked at the woman who had dragged him by his tie into a new reality. "The city is watching," he murmured, looking down at the lights far below.
Let them watch, Naira replied, taking his hand. They're looking at a man who finally decided to own his soul instead of his empire.
3 years had passed, and the rain and soul felt different. No longer the cold, suffocating shroud of a hunted man, but a clean, rhythmic pulse against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Montelus Tower. The office at the summit was a temple of minimalist glass and warm wood, smelling of green tea and the faint, nostalgic scent of expensive cedar. Gone were the shadows of the Onyx Lounge and the stagnant air of the subway tunnels. In their place was a clarity that only the truth could provide. Varric stood by the window, his bespoke charcoal suit fitting perfectly over shoulders that no longer carried the jagged tension of the underworld. The scar on his cheek had faded to a fine silver line, a map of a previous life that felt more like a myth than a memory. Behind him, the hum of high-speed servers provided the heartbeat of the most successful legitimate logistics and tech firm in East Asia. He had traded the blood of the Mafia for the numbers of the global market, dismantling his criminal architecture piece by piece until only the foundation of a legitimate powerhouse remained. "The merger with the Singapore group is finalized," a voice said, breaking his reverie. Varric turned to see Naira walking toward him. She wore a tailored black vest over a crisp white shirt, a sophisticated echo of the uniform she had worn the night they met. She didn't carry a tray of drinks. She held a tablet that controlled the flow of information across 3 continents. As his chief strategist and partner, she was the architect of their peace. She remained the watchman, the one who saw the patterns in the chaos before they could form into threats. "You're thinking about the obsidian," she said, standing beside him. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking about the tie," Varric admitted, a rare, genuine smile softening his features. "And the woman who had the audacity to drag a king into the light." Naira set the tablet down and reached out, her fingers catching the knot of his silk tie with the same proprietary strength she had shown 3 years ago. She adjusted it with a slow, deliberate precision. "You weren't a king then, Varric. You were just a target who didn't know he was being hunted. Now you're something much more dangerous, a man with nothing to hide." The transition hadn't been easy. There had been legal battles, the quiet disappearing of old rivals, and the slow, painful process of earned redemption. Mael's sister, Hana, was thriving in a clinic in Jeju, her breath a gift from the very miracle Varric and Naira had ensured was real. Mael himself was a ghost of a different kind, living a quiet, repentant life under a new name, a testament to the mercy Varric had chosen on that rooftop. Varric placed his hand over Naira's, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse of a life built on a tactical covenant. They had survived the dark syndicate, the betrayal of brothers, and the erasure of their identities, to build a kingdom that didn't require a single bullet to maintain. "The Queen's Gambit," Varric murmured, looking from the city lights to the woman who had saved him. "The game is never really over, Varric," Naira replied, her eyes reflecting the glowing grid of the city they had reclaimed. "But for the first time, we aren't just playing to survive, we're playing to win." The rain continued to fall, but as they stood together at the edge of the sky, the crosshairs were gone. The soul of the city was at peace, and the watchman was home.